Good afternoon. My name is Istine, and today we are going to walk through the fascinating journey of an X-ray photon. This isn't just a lecture about buttons and machines, it's an exploration into the physics of energy conversion and the manipulation of subatomic particles to see the invisible. We're going to examine how we start with simple electricity and transform it into a diagnostic tool that has revolutionized medicine over the last century. This presentation serves as a comprehensive review of the core principles of radiology physics that govern our daily practice in the clinical setting, ensuring we provide the highest quality care while maintaining the strict safety standards required in our field. Before we dive into the hardware, let's look at a roadmap for today's session. Our primary goal is to master the big picture of image formation. We will begin by identifying the physical anatomy of the X-ray tube, the very heart of the machine. From there, we will transition into the two-step production process. First, the preparation of electrons via thermionic emission, and second, the high-speed impact of those electrons into a target to create photons. We will also dissect the beam itself, looking at critical relationship between the quantity and quality. And finally, we'll explore the three main interactions that occur when a beam enters the human patient. The X-ray tube is an incredible piece of engineering designed to manage extreme levels of energy. Imagine a high-performance engine. It needs a cooling system and a protected casing. Our tube housing is a lead-lined to act as a fortress, preventing leakage radiation from escaping in every direction and ensuring it only leaves through the window. Inside, we have a glass or metal envelope that maintains a perfect vacuum. This vacuum is absolutely essential. If there were even a few air molecules inside, the electrons would collide with them and lose their kinetic energy before ever reaching the target. On the negative side, we have the cathode, which acts as our electron launcher. And on the positive side, the rotating tungsten anode, which acts as our landing pad, designed to dissipate the massive heat generated during this process. Step 1 of our journey is gathering our ammunition, a process scientifically known as thermionic emission. Think of the tungsten filament like a heating element in a kitchen toaster. As we apply a high current, the filament gets white hot, and the outer shell electrons literally boil off of the surface. However, they don't just fly away yet. They form a space charge cloud hovering right in front of the filament in a state of electrostatic equilibrium. This is our reservoir of potential X-rays. The milliamperage settings we choose on our console is the primary factor here. It is essentially the volume knob that determines exactly how many electrons are sitting in that cloud, ready to be fired across the tube at a moment's notice. Now, we move on to the anode for the actual creation of the X-ray. The first method, which accounts for the majority of our beam, is Bremsstrahlung, or braking radiation. Imagine a high-speed electron flying towards the nucleus of a tungsten atom, like a comet approaching the sun. The nucleus has a strong positive charge that acts like a giant magnet. As the negative electron zips past, the nuclear force pulls on it, causing it to slow down and pivot sharply. That lost kinetic energy has to go somewhere. It is instantly converted into an X-ray photon. Because the electron can be pulled slightly or very aggressively, Bremsstrahlung produces a continuous rainbow or spectrum of different energies. The second method is characteristic radiation, and it is much more violent and specific. In this interaction, the incoming projectile electron doesn't just fly past the nucleus, it actually collides with an inner shell electron of the tungsten atom and knocks it completely out of orbit. This leaves an unstable hole in the atom structure. To fix this, an electron from an outer shell drops in to fill the void, a process where we call this the characteristic cascade. When that electron drops down, it releases energy in the form of a photon that is exactly equal to the distance in binding energy between those two shells. This is why we call it characteristic. The energy is unique, discrete, or the fingerprint of the tungsten atom itself. Now let's analyze the beam that we've just created. Quantity is the total number of X-ray photons in this useful beam. To satisfy our course requirements, we must remember the four distinct factors that affect this. First is milliamperage per second, our primary controller. Doubling the mass doubles the photons in direct linear relationship. Second is distance. According to the inverse square law, as we move further away, the beam spreads out and the intensity drops significantly. Third is kVp, which increases quantity roughly by the square of the ratio. Finally, we have filtration, which actually decreases quantity by soaking up the low-end photons that wouldn't be useful for our image anyway, effectively straining the beam. While quantity is about how many, quality is about how strong. Quality refers to the penetrating power of the X-ray beam, its ability to pass through dense anatomy to reach the detector. Our primary controller here is kVp. Higher voltage gives electrons more speed, which in turn creates higher energy, more penetrating photons. We think also to use this aluminum filtration to harden the beam. Think of filtration like a grit filter on a lens. It removes the soft or low-end energy X-rays that would only be absorbed by the patient's skin. By removing the weak ones, the average energy of the beam that actually hits the patient is much higher, which is a critical part of the Alera principle. Once the beam leaves the tube and enters the patient, it's like a crowd of people trying to navigate a dense forest. We see three main outcomes. First is transmission. The photon passes straight through the patient without hitting a single atom, striking the detector to create the dark, burnt-in areas of the image. Second, absorption. The photon hits an atom and is stopped completely, which creates the bright or white areas of the image. Third is scattering. The photon hits an atom, bounces off in a new direction, and loses energy. The delicate balance between these three interactions is what gives us the contrast and the detail we need for a diagnostic study. The photoelectric effect is the hero of image contrast, but the villain of patient dose. This occurs when an X-ray photon hits an inner shell electron and is completely absorbed by that atom. Because the photon is totally gone, it never reaches the image receptor, leaving a blank or a white spot on our image. This is exactly why bones look white on a radiograph. They are dense and have a high atomic number, so they act like sponges for these photons. However, because the patient's body is absorbing 100% of this energy, the interaction is the primary contributor to the total radiation dose the patient receives during the exam. On the other hand, we have Compton scattering, which is generally required or considered the enemy of high-quality radiograph. This happens when a photon interacts with an outer shell electron. Instead of being absorbed, the photon is merely deflected off course and travels in a random direction with reduced energy. These scattered photons eventually hit the detector, but because they're no longer traveling in a straight line from the source, they create a fog or a noise that blurs our image contrast. Furthermore, this scatter is the primary source of radiation dose to us, the technologists, which is why we must always utilize shielding and distance. To wrap up, we have differential absorption, which is the very foundation of radiography. It is the simple fact that different tissues filter the X-ray beam in different ways, based upon their density and atomic number. Bone is like a brick wall. It absorbs radiation via the photoelectric effect. Air in the lungs is like an open window. It transmits radiation. Soft tissue is somewhere in the middle, like a screen door. Because of these differences, we get a detailed map of the internal anatomy. By mastering these physics principles, from tube components to the control of scatter, through collimation and grids, we can produce images that are as safe as they are diagnostic. Now, we must address the noise in our signal, scatter radiation. Scatter is essentially random radiation that has no diagnostic value. It doesn't tell us anything about the anatomy it passed through. Think of it like trying to take a clear photograph through a thick, heavy fog. The scatter creates a generalized graying out of the image, which we call radiation fog, and this significantly lowers our overall image contrast. As technologists, we have to stay vigilant because scatter isn't consistent. It is increased by three specific factors: using a higher KVP, which creates more energetic scatter, using a larger field size, which irradiates more tissue, and finally, by the thickness of the patients themselves. The more atoms there are in the path of the beam, the more opportunities there are for a Compton interaction to occur. Because scatter is so detrimental to our image quality, we use three primary strategies to control it. First, collimation, which is our most effective tool because it stops scatter before it is even created by restricting the beam only to the area of interest. The second strategy is the use of grids. Imagine a picket fence made of thin lead strips. It allows the straight primary X-rays to pass through the receptor while catching the angled scatter photons. Finally, we have the air gap technique, which, by increasing the distance between the patient and the image receptor, we create a physical space that allows the scattered photons to diverge and fly right past the detector instead of hitting it. By mastering these three tools, we ensure that the only photons hitting our receptor are the ones that actually carry diagnostic information. To conclude our review, let's take a look at the pillars of X-ray physics. We must always remember that the X-ray production is an incredibly inefficient process. Over 99% of the energy we put into the tube is wasted as heat, with less than 1% actually becoming the X-rays we use. As technologists, we hold the power to control this beam. We use milliamperage per second to dictate the quantity or intensity, and kVp to determine the quality or penetrability. We've seen how the photoelectric effect creates our contrast while Compton scattering tries to degrade it, and how the entire image relies on the principle of differential absorption. By using collimation and grids effectively, we can produce high-quality diagnostic images that are as safe for the patient as they are useful for the radiologist. This concludes my presentation. The image presented today was synthesized from our core curriculum texts, primarily the 2025 13th edition of Radiologic Science for Technologists by Stuart Bushong. Other vital resources included Fauber's Radiographic Imaging and Exposure and Johnston's Essentials of Radiographic Physics. Thank you for your time, and have a blessed rest of your day.